Chapter 6. Larinna. There had always been those who sought to chain the waves. First there were the navies, vast fleets of ships that sought to protect the sovereignty of the waters in which they sailed, joyless people in bright uniforms who flew their flag proudly as they went forth and conquered, driving their banners deep into other people's soil and warring with anyone who fought back. For all that, Larinna merely disliked the navy, as she could understand, if not sympathize with, the kind of people who felt most comfortable when following orders given from on high. The kind of people who would march to a beat, stand at attention, and polish their boots until they were precisely as polished as boots should be. The kind of people who wouldn't kill out of fury or malice, but would kill because they were told to. Growing up, Larinna had watched a few of the older children leaving their homes in the company of gleaming men with neat moustaches and shining medals on their chests. When they returned to visit their families, they always looked so smart and so prideful. But she could tell, just by watching how they sat stiffly in the local pub, and the way they flinched at unexpected sounds, even sudden laughter, that something had happened to them while they'd been away. Some flame inside them had been snuffed out, and now they didn't belong anywhere. They were just like chess pieces, she'd thought. Soldiers in a box, jumbled up and waiting to be placed back on the battlefield, where they could be useful. On the other hand, Larinna loathed the trading companies. They were swaggering gangs of bullying merchants who were precisely as greedy and grasping as the most devious pirates, but somehow acceptable to the stuffed shirts back on land. They tended to be run by wealthy, cunning, and unscrupulous people who were looking for ways to get even richer, and so had sailed out to the wilder parts of the world, looking to ply their wares at ports and colonies far from home. Larinna didn't have anything against someone trying to make a living by whatever means they chose, of course. Far from it. In her experience, however, the trading companies had no intention of sharing the seas where they wished to do business, not with each other, and certainly not with the pirates, who sought to disrupt their trade and claim the spoils for themselves. Years long past had seen lone company ships with their cargoes of fine silks and strange powders become easy targets for experienced pirates who'd grown up in the region and knew the waters far more intimately than their prey did. But the companies proved both rich and tenacious, and more ships came. Larger ships now sailed in convoys, laden with a veritable army of soldiers who dealt with any opposition as ruthlessly and efficiently as if they were sailing by royal command. Sometimes they were, for the larger companies began to hold sway back home, and thus guarantee themselves the best protection king and country could provide. Soon it was the locals who had reason to fear, whether they were pirates or not. Getting caught in the crossfire between two squabbling trading companies could really ruin your day, not to mention your livelihood, if a fragile little ship was all you had. Larinna had heard tell of local traders being declared pirates and hauled away for questioning, merely for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Even if they managed to escape the jailer's cells eventually, they often found that their assets had been seized, and what had once been theirs now belonged mysteriously to the companies. Worse still, as far as Larinna was concerned, the proliferation of these big businesses made the world feel like a cage. The sea was more than just a series of territories and trade routes marked on a musty old map. You couldn't own it, even if you thought you could, and sooner or later it'd swallow up anyone who dared to try. All this went some way to explaining why, in her first one-on-one conversation with Adelaide, Larinna damn near put her fist through the window. Adelaide had led her into a sumptuous captain's cabin that was every bit as ostentatious as its owner, filled with pillows, gewgaws, and paintings of places Larinna didn't recognize. Once inside, she reclined in a velvet chair, placing her booted feet upon the desk with deliberate care before speaking. "I'm sure you took a good look around the outpost today," she said airily. "You probably noticed a few tents and stalls that didn't seem to have anything for sale. Flourishing business ventures, you might say, with some more pathetic than others, of course." Larinna thought guiltily back to her rowboat for a moment, and then the truth of what Adelaide was saying dawned upon her. "Businesses?" she hissed. "You're talking about more bloody trading companies. That's who you work for now?" Larinna smashed her fist against the surface of the desk with such ferocity that Adelaide's shoes momentarily left its surface, and the young captain looked genuinely alarmed. "It's not like the old days," she snapped offensively. "Not out here. Yes, some of them snuck into the Sea of Thieves, looking to make an easy coin or two, greedy merchants who bribed or bartered their way here, sniffing for a profit. Do you know what they found?" "Surprise me," Larinna said sourly. "Us," Adelaide smirked. "You can't tame this place. They sailed into our waters with their royal decrees and their fancy crests, and they might as well have painted targets on their backs. We pirates have got long memories, and we like to hold grudges. For once, they were outnumbered." "I suppose I can see that," Larinna conceded. Although she'd been trapped, lurking below decks on her own journey to the Sea of Thieves, she knew enough about the Devil's Shroud to see how a huge vessel loaded with soldiers, not to mention the kind of firepower needed to protect a company ship and its valuable cargo, would surely sink in any attempt at a crossing. "So they gave up?" "Mostly," Adelaide agreed. "And for a long while, until one day some clever little clerk realized that if pirates were the problem, maybe they could be the solution. Some crews might be convinced into earning a little extra gold by handing over things we find and don't need, like animals or old artifacts, stuff that might sell well out in the wider world." The knot of tension in Larinna's stomach loosened slightly, and she began pacing slowly around the cabin as she considered Adelaide's words. "And you, Faisal, Ned, all of you work for these companies?" "Occasionally, if it's to our advantage." Adelaide watched Larinna keenly as she moved back and forth, the captain seemingly eager not to provoke another outburst. "Most of the larger outposts have company representatives to trade with, and if you keep your end of the bargain, you start to build a reputation, for better or worse," she added, irritably flicking an imaginary speck of dirt from her boot. Larinna was silent for a long while as she reflected on what was being asked of her. Grudgingly, she had to admit that the relationship between pirates and profiteers sounded far more even-handed than how things had been back home. More than that, she still needed a crew. "I think I hate everything about this," she informed Adelaide coolly. "Now, tell me what you want me to do." Sanctuary Outpost felt quite different, bathed in moonlight, though Larinna wasn't surprised to see that many of the merchants and traders were still open for business. Even the shipwright was still at her stall by the dock, humming contentedly to herself as she worked on restoring a battered figurehead to some semblance of its former glory. Larinna had noted that almost everything on the Sea of Thieves had been repeatedly patched or repaired in some way. The people around her had a self-sufficiency she found quite admirable. "Except when they're begging for scraps from trading companies," she thought irritably, as the squat little building Adelaide had described came into view. It was lavishly decorated by the standards of the outpost, with strings of coloured lanterns and a few hung banners cut from the same rich purple cloth that the cloaked figures had been wearing. As they drew closer, Larinna realized that the Order had apparently colonized the underside of someone else's property, draping heavy fabric around its stilts to create a makeshift establishment of their own. There was a slightly bitter smell in the air that seemed to be getting stronger as she approached, and Larinna wondered if it had anything to do with the pale green smoke that was curling out from gaps between the drapes. A scrawny young woman, barely more than a teenager, was sitting on a barrel near the entrance with her legs swinging, staring down at the ground in apparent contemplation as she gnawed thoughtfully on a strip of salt jerky. She glanced up sharply as Larinna approached, watching owlishly, but saying nothing, until her fingers were already reaching for the door handle. "We're closed," she barked suddenly, and flushed angrily as Larinna ignored her, pulling open a fold of fabric to bathe them both in a strange pale light. "It's hard to be closed when you don't have a door," Larinna remarked, stepping inside, even as the girl hopped fretfully off her barrel and began to trail her, complaining peevishly. The tent's interior was as gaudy as Larinna had expected, with chains of dark beads hanging in the entryway and a few crude stars painted on what passed for a ceiling. Yet more of the purple fabric hung in great folds from beams of the building overhead, muffling her footsteps as she moved deeper inside. A sickly green fire, apparently the source of both the odd light and the strange smoke, crackled and spluttered fitfully in a large apparatus. It caused strange shadows to dance upon the ceiling, and also illuminated a large desk, behind which a figure was hunched, an inkwell in one hand and a large black quill in the other. Larinna was starting to feel that everything she'd seen so far was designed to foster a particular impression of mysticism and otherworldliness. The entire facade, she suspected, had been decorated to further the illusion that mysterious things were about to happen. A haunted house to get pirates suitably spooked so that they'd come away impressed. They're still a trading company at heart, she reminded herself, and they need you more than you need them. "Don't linger, Aggie. You're letting fresh air in," murmured the man behind the desk to the young girl reproachfully, without glancing up from his work. His long, greasy hair fell messily down past his shoulders and across another purple outfit. Given the trappings of the place, Larinna was unsurprised to see him sifting through a box stuffed full of mysterious runes and diligently copying them down onto a scroll. The man looked up from counting on his fingers as Larinna coughed and shot a meaningful glare at the girl. Clearly, she'd been posted as an advance guard tasked with turning away anyone who might interrupt him in the middle of some elaborate task, and clearly she had failed. "I told her, Dad," Aggie complained. "She wouldn't listen." The man peered up at Larinna, and she stared down at him, arms folded. "New in town, are we?" he asked, the tone of his voice indicating that he didn't particularly want to hear the answer. "My name is Winston Phoebus. I represent the Order of Souls, and we are currently closed. Come back tomorrow." Like his daughters, his speech was high and peevish, a voice born to complain and wheedle. "I'll be long over the horizon when tomorrow comes," Larinna replied evenly. "But I could hardly pass through without coming to see this place for myself, just to see if the rumors were true." As she'd hoped, the man's expression was immediately awash with a mixture of indignation and curiosity. He's a showman, she realized. Every showman wants applause. "Rumors?" he snapped. "What rumors?" It was time to see if what little Adelaide had told her about the Order was true, or if she was about to make a fool of herself. Oh, more like hearsay, really. That your group possesses a great wisdom and a knowledge that sees far beyond the veil that clouds the sight of others. That through your tireless efforts, the secrets of the Sea of Thieves are laid bare for your eyes alone, and 1,000 destinies revealed. She paused, wondering if she'd gone overboard, but Phoebus seemed genuinely pleased by the description, his whole demeanour having softened considerably. Oh, it's far more than hearsay, I can assure you. There was an unmistakable smugness in his eyes as he reached into his desk and pulled out a number of neatly bound parchments, fanning them out with a practiced ease. Every one of these contracts may represent nothing more than a handsome sum of money to yourself, but they also provide our distinguished cartographers with invaluable information. I see, said Larinna, who didn't, but managed to look suitably impressed regardless. The pursuit of enlightenment through the mystic arts is a responsibility that must weigh heavily upon your spirit. She glanced down at the box of runes, then around at the tent that passed for the Order's premises, before adding, and your wallet. Phoebus appeared to deflate a little. Yes, well, from time to time we are encouraged to share our wisdom with others, he admitted. For a price, of course. Not that we do it for the money, you understand. We prefer to focus on a more noble purpose. But everyone needs to eat. Unfortunately, our most recent contract fell through, which has left us rather in a bind. He paused. You're quite sure you can't come back tomorrow? It must be terribly frustrating, having to deal with small-minded scoundrels who can't appreciate that you're working toward a higher purpose, Larinna agreed, maintaining a sympathetic expression. But as I said, tomorrow I shall be at sea, for I have a purpose of my own, though it's nothing so noble as yours. She patted the hilt of her sword theatrically. Before the day is done, my blade shall have claimed its final vengeance against that cur, Simeon, and his treachery shall be repaid. Adelaide had assured her that this Simeon, whomever he was, would mean something to the Order, but had told her nothing else. Phoebus was staring at her with a curious expression. Not Steel Eye Simeon, surely, he pressed. Larinna, who had no idea, kept her expression inscrutable. To her surprise, invoking the name had lit a fire within the man, and he was frantically rifling through cupboards and cabinets, scattering parchments here and there until he emerged with a small box clasped triumphantly in his hands. I thought I recognized the name, he said triumphantly. Steel Eye Simeon, yes. Yeah, we've had quite a few sightings of him recently. For a moment, he seemed to be about to offer the scroll, but hesitation overtook him. It's not the sort of contract we'd normally give to a first-timer, he mused. We prefer to offer lower-value work until people have proven they're capable. Larinna had no idea what Simeon had to do with map-making, but she didn't have to work too hard at feigning offense. As far as the Order was concerned, this was her lifelong nemesis they were discussing. I'll hunt down Simeon with or without your help, she growled, and once I catch him, there'll be nothing left for your capable pirates. She felt like she was bluffing on a hand of cards she hadn't seen, in a game where she didn't really understand the rules. Fortunately, her gamble paid off, and Phoebus practically shoved the box into her hands. It's all the information we have, he said beseechingly. But we'll pay you handsomely when you return. He insisted on taking Larinna's name into a leather-bound volume and pressing her thumb down onto an inky pad, badgering her to provide a print alongside her signature. As she signed, she spotted Adelaide's name farther up the page, though it had been viciously crossed out in bold strokes of purple ink. "Can't be forged," he explained. Rubbing at her inky thumb absent-mindedly, Larinna tucked the scroll into her belt and allowed herself to be shown out, still feeling she was missing a piece of the puzzle. Finally, she paused just outside the tent, her curiosity overwhelming her. "Remind me," she called. "What do I do with Simeon once I have him?" "Do?" Phoebus had already returned to his runes, but he looked up now, clearly puzzled by such an elementary and obvious question. "Why, bring us his head, of course." Larinna returned to the Unforgiven, with her thoughts in a whirl, more baffled now than before her mysterious errand, and determined to get some answers at last. Striding into the captain's cabin and dropping the box onto the desk with a satisfying thunk, she placed both hands on either side of it and glared across at Adelaide, who was peeling an apple with a thin-bladed knife that she always kept on her belt. "What the hell did I just agree to?" she demanded. "Are we bounty hunters now?" "In a manner of speaking," Adelaide said, clearly amused by Larinna's irritation. "They want what's in Simeon's head, and it's up to us to provide it. What did you think of the order?" "A bunch of tricksters pretending they're mystics and magicians," Larinna said coldly, forcing herself to adopt a less confrontational stance. "With some very strange business practices. When are you going to tell me what's really going on?" "All in good time," the smaller woman replied soothingly. "Think of this as your initiation, if that helps. I'm trusting you, and I want you to trust me in return." She reached into the box and removed a scroll from within, unfurling it and staring down at the faded lines and scrawled notes that covered it. Larinna thought she vaguely recognized one or two of the tiny landmarks from her brief time in the map room, but it was hard to say for sure. "That far out, eh?" Adelaide mused, lingering over the parchment for a moment before suddenly springing to her feet. "This should be fun!" She left the cabin at a trot, and by the time Larinna had followed her out, she was already up at the helm, calling across to Ned as he began to unfurl the sails. Grumbling, Larinna took hold of the capstan alongside Faisal, who seemed as chatty as ever as they started weighing the anchor. "I see that your visit to the Order of Souls was a success," he called over the clanking and creaking. "Their ways seem a little strange, yes, but they pay handsomely, and I think they are harmless enough." "Harmless?" Larinna shot back. "They try to rob you." Faisal gave a little shrug. "Negotiations sometimes work a little differently out here. I guarantee that you will see many stranger things, but then that is why you came to the Sea of Thieves, I think." Much to her annoyance, Larinna found that she had no answer to that. Once they'd cast off, the lanterns were lit, and the sails were billowing with a fair wind, the crew gathered around Adelaide in the map room. "It seems the last sighting of old Steel Eye was at an abandoned fort near Cannon Cove," she told them. "Quite a nasty place, I hear, but we've got surprise and the night on our side." "Yeah, I know the one you mean." Ned squinted down at the map and then pointed to a nondescript group of rocks, too small and insignificant even to have a name of their own. "It's got cannons all down the south side and on the top though, so if they seize us—" "I am not coming home empty-handed twice in a row," Adelaide declared hotly. "We'll drop anchor here," she jabbed her own finger at the map, "and swim the rest of the way if we have to." "And if this bounty, this Simeon, is not at the fort after all?" Faisal asked, staring at the expanse of water under Adelaide's fingertip with a doleful expression. "Then we'll get on those cannons ourselves and make some noise until he shows himself," Adelaide insisted. The Order may be a bunch of irritable blowhards with delusions of grandeur, but they're not in the habit of sending people on wild goose chases. Simeon will be there." With no more to say, they headed back up above deck, and despite Faisal's suggestion that she get some rest in one of the hammocks below deck, Larinna volunteered to take a shift in the crow's nest. She felt restless and out of sorts, and when it came to it, she knew why. She'd come to the Sea of Thieves to be an explorer, not an executioner, and now her first voyage into the unknown was set to end with her sticking a man she'd never met for reasons she didn't fully understand. Hardly an auspicious beginning. She tried to distract herself by memorizing the more distinctive islands, memorizing their positions relative to one another, and making mental notes of places she'd like to one day visit. Another ship appeared on the horizon at one point, but veered away before Larinna could call out. Evidently, they too had some dark business this night. Finally making use of the spyglass Ned had lent her, she spotted the fort on the horizon, and could tell at once that nasty was just the way to describe it. The core of the place was a large rock spire devoid of vegetation that rose upward in a twisting spiral with a flat, stumpy summit. The fortress spiraled up and around the spire in a complicated lattice of bridges and walkways, occasionally branching out to watchtowers and ledges on which she could spy the cannons Ned had mentioned. Down below, huge wooden stakes jutted out from the base of the fort at various angles. Some were mere branches, others as thick as tree trunks, and any ship that dared to sail too close risked skewering themselves upon them. Another reason to berth far, far away. Perhaps it was just her imagination, but even the clouds around the fort seemed ominous and foreboding. Once or twice, Larinna swore she could make out a death's head billowing above them, though she was sure it was just her imagination. Faisal and Ned were extinguishing the lanterns one by one as they drew closer, and Larinna climbed carefully down from the crow's nest to help furl the sails and slow the ship so it could be steered safely to its hiding place. Then the crew clambered down the ship's ladder one by one and dropped lightly into the chilly water. It was cold enough to sting, and Larinna had to fight the urge to swim for the shallows at speed, for even that might be enough noise to give them away. Paddling quietly, they braved the freezing sea in silence until they reached the shallows, wending their way through the vicious stakes. Faisal, in particular, seemed uncharacteristically nervous, and even Ned seemed uneasy. Only Adelaide was as cocksure as ever, drawing her sword once they reached the slimy rocks that served as both the foundation of the fort and the start of the pathway that led to its uppermost levels. Larinna had expected to see guards patrolling, if the fort was indeed occupied as Phoebus had claimed, and the knot in her stomach loosened slightly at the lack of movement. Perhaps Simeon's not here after all. She remained as vigilant as ever, though, and as Faisal reached a sharp right turn and disappeared out of sight ahead of her, Larinna was sure she caught the blur of motion by his foot. She dropped into a crouch, wishing fervently that she could risk unhooding her lantern, if only for a moment, to get a proper look around. She poked out with the blade of her sword experimentally, but found only bones lying haphazardly in a pile of loose shale. Probably a rat, she decided, and turned to follow the crew upward to the next tier of the mouldering barricades. She barely made it 3 steps farther when she heard it, the scrabbling behind her getting louder and more persistent. For an instant, she feared a landslide, that the pathway might be crumbling away beneath them. But even as she turned to shout a warning, the truth sucked the breath from her lungs. A skeletal arm was digging itself out from under a pile of rocks and rubble. As Larinna watched, frozen in horror, a bony cadaver began to emerge out of the ground where it had lain, half buried until the crew's passage had disturbed it. It should have been impossible, the stuff of childhood nightmares. But within a few short seconds, the remains had erupted fully to stand just a few short steps away. And Larinna was staring at a skeleton a few inches taller than she, clad only in a few rags, but clutching a sword of its own. She could see the moonlight streaming straight through its ribcage as it turned, slowly, as if taking in its own surroundings. The dead, dark eye sockets met her own mortified gaze. The lower jaw, yellowing and incomplete, fell slackly open to the accompaniment of a rattling hiss. It was not a happy sound. Worse still, it was answered by other calls from further up the trail. Dragging her gaze away from the shambling creature long enough to glance up the path, Larinna could see Faisal and Adelaide backing slowly toward her as two more of the creatures advanced on them. They weren't just under attack, she realized. They were surrounded.